We're now going to walk through the implementation of the server components so you can see what this actually looks like in real code by looking at the IntelliJ project that contains the solution. And this is going to focus, of course, on the BerraQuotesController and the BerraQuotesService, but we're also going to look at the surrounding elements in the implementation that are used to make that all work. And you can get this implementation here at the link in my GitHub repository in the Live Lessons Web MVC EX2 folder. So now we're in my IntelliJ project for the EX2 example, and we're going to take a look at the server implementation code, starting with the BerraQuotesApplication. So as you can see, this is just a good old Java class. It has a main, which gives you an indication it's an entry point into something. And what it's going to do is it's going to launch the application as a Spring application. And in addition to having this Spring call here, we also have an annotation that says @SpringBootApplication. @SpringBootApplication is a very important annotation. It tells Spring, treat this as an entry point into an application, which in this particular case is a microservice. And it's a microservice because it's doing a very focused set of things relating to returning BerraQuotes. It doesn't mix and match other stuff. We'll talk about other more complicated scenarios of microservices later. So that's the BerraQuotes application. Let's go take a look at the BerraQuotesController. And this shows you a bunch of things that are very common. There's a nice comment block here that explains how all this stuff works. As you can see, we have the BerraQuotesController, which is a REST controller, which tells Spring, please do certain things to this class in terms of sending things back and forth in JSON and so on. And then you can see we have a couple of auto-wired fields. We auto-wire the application context. I won't cover that in detail now. It's basically just a read-only context that can be used to find out kind of metadata about the microservice. We also have the BerraQuotesService, which is this guy. There's the BerraQuotesService. But here, we're just auto-wiring the BerraQuotesService to the BerraQuotesController. So that's going to allow Spring to automatically inject an instance of BerraQuotesService. We don't have to write that factory method. We don't have to write the code that calls the factory method, that assigns it to the field. We can do that. And that gives you other degrees of freedom to make changes to your implementation without having to modify your code. This particular method called info, we'll ignore that for right now. That's used for discovery purposes. Let's go look at the getAllQuotes method. And you can see here we've got a get mapping annotation that says this is what's called an endpoint handler method. And the routing string, the routing name is called getAllQuotes. And this particular field, getAllQuotes, is actually defined over here in a file called constants. And you can see I have getAllQuotes, which is an all-quotes string, getQuotes, which is the quote string, getSearch, which is the search quote string, and then there's one called searchQuery, which is this template variable. So those are just to put everything in one place. Going back to the controller, you can see all we do here is we just forward to the service and say, get me all the quotes. Here is another variant of this called getQuotes. So in this case, we're not going to get all quotes. We're going to get a list of quotes. And the list of quotes are going to be designated by their quote ID. So we'll give a list of integers that correspond to quote IDs. This is, again, annotated with get mapping to indicate it's an endpoint handler method. We have to put a request param here because this is a list of integers, and that gets extracted out of the URI that's passed over when the client makes a call. We'll look at the client here in the next couple of videos. And again, we just forward that to the service. And then the third and final endpoint handler method is search, which is going to be the search router name, plus that search query, which was that template variable that had a slash, open curly brace, query, close curly brace. And that is converted automatically into a thing called a path variable, which is the search query. And then we go ahead and forward that to the service. A couple real quick things to note, and I'll take a question. So what you typically see with controllers is the controller is really the converter between the world of HTTP requests. Right here, we're just looking at GET requests, but we could have the requests, POST requests, and delete requests, and so on, and the world of Java and the Java type system. So by isolating that in one file, we only have to do that transformation in one place, and then we forward to a piece of code that basically is just good old Java. So that greatly simplifies things. Yes, sir?
Sending over HTTP, there's most of the between like a template variable where we use path variable versus like request parameter?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, why would we use the path variable? It's just a different way of doing things. For my money, I actually prefer to pass them as parameters. I think it's a little bit less mysterious. But this is a common idiom. This way of having the template variable is a very common thing in HTTP. And so I suppose if you only have one parameter, then it might make sense to use a path variable just as the final thing. And you'll also see when we do the client side of this, it's very simple to do that. You just basically tag it on to the end. When you start doing these request parameters, you have to use some additional ceremony to have a name and the value and the name and the value. And so it just makes the string a little bit longer. So for very simple things like a search query, the path variable may be the way to go. That's a great question. So that's the controller. Let's go look at the service. So here's the service. You can see, again, the service is largely just good old Java code with a few annotations indicating this is a service so that Spring can do the appropriate class scanning to find dependencies and inject them. The particular dependency we care about here is the mQuotes field, which is auto-wired. And that means that we don't have to write the logic to explicitly initialize this field. That raises the question, however, where does that field get initialized and how is it defined? And the answer is, we go look at the components class, it gets done by a bean. And this is the components. This is a class called components. We mark it to be a configuration, which means it can contain beans. And we have a couple of beans here. Here's one bean that we have. This bean is called getQuotes. You can annotate it as a bean. Bean just basically says this is a factory method that needs to be explicit or implicitly bound to something that is auto-wired to it that matches the type. So the type here is list of quote. And over here you saw that we needed something that was a list of quote. And so what this does is it's going to go ahead and open up a file in the resources portion of this project called Berra-Quotes.txt. And that file, which is over here in resources, contains all the BerraQuotes. Not all the BerraQuotes, there are lots more, but these are the ones that were most pithy that I could do. And he's got all kinds of funny quotes in here. Trying to think of one of my favorite ones. Something like, yeah, here we go. Baseball is 90% mental, and the other half is physical. So if you don't have to be you don't have to have a PhD in mathematics to know there's something wrong with that statement, but it's funny. And so he has all kinds of funny little things. You can observe a lot by just watching. I took a 2-hour nap from 1 o'clock to 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what happens here is that that file is automatically loaded into memory. And then we go through the file and we use a regular expression matching mechanism to split the contents of the file by the @ sign. Every line ended with an @ and then we end up with a stream of these lines. And then we turn each of those lines into a quote object. And I'll show you what the quote object is in a second. So a quote object is something that's a record. A Java record is a type that was introduced relatively recently. I think it went in maybe Java 14 or so, maybe got finalized in Java 16. And a record is basically a data holding entity. Unlike a Java object, which contains other stuff like a virtual pointer and an intrinsic lock and an intrinsic condition object, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A record just contains the data parameters that are defined. So here a record contains an ID that's an integer, which it should say the quote name, and the quote, which is the quote that we have from Yogi Berra. And so what we do is we make a new quote that includes the actual quote by Yogi Berra, and we increment the count by 1, and we just keep a running count of the ID. So every ID is incremented by 1. And then we return these results as a list. So that's where the components come from. And here's the Berra service. And as you can see, get all quotes just returns the quote. As you can see, the get quotes method turns the list of integer quote IDs into a stream and then does this mapping to get the elements that we're looking for out of the quotes list and turns it back into a list. And then the final thing is searching, which converts the quotes list into a stream and then locates everything that matches the query parameter that got there from the template variable in the URI that came across from the client. And you can see we take the quote, we lowercase the quote, and then we check to see if it contains the query. And then we turn the results into a list. So we convert the stream into a list. You can see we start by converting the list to a stream. We then do the filtering, then we turn the stream back into a list. So that's basically the end of the walkthrough of the server implementation stuff.